My name is Marisol Navarro. I am 34 years old, and I used to believe that if you worked hard enough for your family, they would eventually see you. I was wrong. I grew up in the kind of house where the rules were never written down because they didn't need to be. Everyone already knew them. My father, Ernesto Navarro, was the center of every room he entered, not because he demanded it, though he did, but because the family had arranged itself around him the way furniture arranges itself around a fireplace. Everything pointed toward him. Everything waited for his warmth or his chill. I was the middle child, which in our family meant I was the invisible one. My older brother, Diego, was my father's project, the son he was going to build something with. My younger sister, Camille, was my mother's comfort, the soft one, the one who called every Sunday and never made waves. I was neither of those things. I was the one who left. At 19, I took a partial scholarship to a state university 4 hours away, declared a finance major, and paid the rest with work study and a part-time job at a copy center that smelled like hot toner and stale coffee. My father did not come to my graduation. He said it conflicted with a golf trip he had already planned. My mother sent a card with a $20 bill folded inside it, which she told me later was my father's idea of a joke. I was never fully sure whether that was true. My father never asked what I was working toward. He never thought to. If you have ever watched someone build something quietly, for years without anyone in their family looking up, you already know the texture of what came next. After graduation, I went to work at a mid-size commercial real estate investment firm in Atlanta. I was not a natural at the social side of the business. I did not play golf, I did not drink scotch, I did not tell the right stories at the right dinners. What I was good at was the numbers. I could look at a property's income schedule and cash flow projection and see the error inside 30 seconds in a way that took my senior colleagues 3 hours and a spreadsheet. Within 2 years, I was the person they handed the complicated files to. Within 4, I was running due diligence on acquisitions that moved between $2 and $8 million. I rented a small apartment in Midtown Atlanta, drove a used car I had paid cash for, and saved at a rate that my friends found alarming. I did not save because I was afraid. I saved because I had a plan, and the plan was specific. I was going to buy my parents a house. I had already started a manila folder for it. One printed search result, a number I was working toward, the beginning of a file I intended to complete. Not because they asked. They never asked. My father, in fact, had said on more than one occasion that he did not need anything from me, phrasing it in a way that made clear he meant it as an observation about my capacity rather than his self-sufficiency. But I had watched my parents spend 30 years in a house with a leaking roof and a furnace that failed every other February, and I had decided, somewhere around my 27th birthday, that I was going to fix it. The house I found was in Scottsdale, Arizona, where my parents had talked about retiring since I was a child. 3 bedrooms, single story, a covered patio that faced west. It was listed at $966,000. I had saved enough for a substantial down payment and structured the rest through a purchase I controlled entirely. The deed in a holding arrangement I set up through my firm's legal counsel, documented in a manila folder I kept in my desk. The holding instrument, the title summary, the transfer provisions. With a transfer mechanism that required my signature to complete and that I understood completely and my parents did not ask about. I told my father about it on a Tuesday night in March, over a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. I told him the address, the square footage, the year it was built, the distance from the nearest hospital. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "How'd you manage that?" Not a question. A verdict. The kind of sentence that sounds like acknowledgement but is actually a door being left slightly ajar so the draft can come through. My mother cried. That part was real. They moved in the following September. I flew out to help them unpack. I spent 4 days assembling furniture, organizing the kitchen, learning where the water shutoff was so I could explain it to my father, who listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. On the last evening I sat on the covered patio and watched the sky go orange over the mountains and felt something that was close to satisfaction, though not quite. I flew back to Atlanta on a Thursday morning. My father did not come to the airport. The first time my father made clear, in front of witnesses, that I did not belong in the family's inner circle was 8 months after they moved into the house I bought them. It was the week of my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and my mother had organized a dinner at a restaurant in Scottsdale. A private room, 12 people, white tablecloths. My father's 2 brothers and their wives. Diego and his girlfriend at the time. Camille and her husband, Marco. And me, flying in from Atlanta on a Friday evening, taking a cab directly from the airport to the restaurant because there had been no offer of a pickup. I arrived 7 minutes late because the cab line was long. The private room was already loud with conversation. My father was at the head of the table in a dark blazer, holding a glass of red wine, and when I pushed open the door he looked at me the way you look at a waiter who has arrived at the wrong moment. "Marisol," he said. Not a greeting. An identification. I found my seat between one of my uncles and an empty chair. The empty chair had a small folded card on it. I picked it up. It said Diego. I put it back down. Diego was already seated on my father's left, which meant the card was from an earlier arrangement that no one had updated, which meant no one had expected to need to update it, which meant my presence at this table had been so peripheral to the planning that not even the seating chart had been told I was coming. My uncle leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "You look good," he said, and then turned back to the conversation he had been having. The dinner moved the way those dinners always moved. My father told a story about a business deal from 15 years ago that everyone at the table had heard before, and everyone laughed at the right moment because it was easier than not laughing. Diego gave a short toast that used the word legacy twice. Camille cried a little and dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, and Marco put his hand on the back of her chair. I cut my salmon into even pieces and ate it. Toward the end of the main course, my father's older brother asked what everyone had been up to. He was making his way around the table. Diego talked about a project at his company. Camille talked about renovating their guest bathroom. When he got to me, I said I had just closed a due diligence process on a mixed-use acquisition in Nashville, which had taken 11 weeks and come in under the projected risk threshold. There was a brief silence. My father picked up his wine glass and said, "She works in real estate," to his brother, in the tone of someone summarizing a Wikipedia article. Then he turned to Diego and asked about the project timeline. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate and looked at the tablecloth for a moment before I picked it up again. The salmon had gone slightly cold. After dinner, while the table was being cleared and people were clustering into small conversations, my mother found me near the window. She put her hand on my arm. She smelled like the perfume she had worn since I was a child, something floral and powdery that I had always associated with her trying. "Your father is proud of you," she said. "He just doesn't always know how to show it." I had heard this sentence, or a version of it, at least 30 times in my life. I knew better than to argue with it in the middle of my parents' anniversary dinner. I nodded and said, "I know, Mom." She squeezed my arm and went back to my father's side. Outside, waiting for my cab in the warm Scottsdale night, I took out my phone and looked at the flight confirmation I had booked to return to Atlanta the next morning. I thought about changing it to that same night. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and went inside to say goodnight. Diego and my father were standing by the bar talking. Neither of them looked up when I came back through the door. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked over to my mother, kissed her cheek, told her the dinner was beautiful, and left. In the cab, my throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the salmon. I pressed my knuckles against the cool window glass and watched the restaurant lights fall away behind me and said nothing out loud, because there was nothing to say that would have made any difference. That dinner was not the beginning. It was just the first time I watched it happen in a mirror clean enough to see clearly. The pattern had been running for years. I had simply been too close to it, and too busy filing it under "that's just how he is," to recognize it as a pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. The first one I remember with any real clarity happened when I was 26 and had just gotten my promotion to senior analyst. I called home to tell them. My father picked up, which was unusual. He usually handed the phone to my mother within 90 seconds. I told him about the promotion, the new title, the raise. He said, "Good, good," in the way you say it when someone is telling you about traffic. Then he told me Diego had just been made a shift supervisor at the distribution company where he worked, which was a real step up, he said, and they were thinking about throwing him a little dinner. He asked if I thought I could make it. I said yes. He said great, your mother will be glad, and then he said he had to go. I sat on my apartment floor for a while after that call. Not crying. Just sitting. The dinner for Diego happened 6 weeks later. It was at the house, not a restaurant, my mother's cooking, which was the real celebration in our family, the one that meant something. My father gave a short speech standing at the head of the dinner table. He talked about Diego's work ethic, his reliability, the fact that he showed up every day and never complained. He said he was proud. He used the word proud out loud in front of the whole family, and Diego looked at his plate with a smile that he was clearly trying to keep from getting too big. I sat at the far end of the table and ate my mother's rice and chicken and told myself it didn't bother me. It bothered me. 3 years later, when I closed my first acquisition, a $2.4 million industrial property outside of Birmingham that I had sourced, analyzed, and pushed through underwriting mostly on my own, I did not call home. I took myself out to a nice dinner alone, had a glass of wine, and drove back to my apartment. The decision not to call was not dramatic. It was just the obvious one. What I did do in those years was work. And the work was not abstract, it was specific, and it was for them, even when they did not know it. I paid for the structural repairs on the old house in December of the year I turned 28, $6,000 for the roof and another $3,200 for the furnace replacement, routed quietly through a contractor I found online and paid before my father could turn it into an argument about accepting help. I told my mother after the fact. She thanked me. My father, when she told him, said he would have handled it. I covered the moving costs when they relocated to Scottsdale, the full-service movers, the packing materials, the storage unit for the 3 weeks between closing on the old house and taking possession of the new one. $11,400. I did not mention it at dinner. I paid the property taxes on the Scottsdale house for the first 2 years out of a separate account I had set up specifically for the purpose, because the carrying costs were mine and I had structured it that way intentionally. $4,100 the first year. $4,300 the second. I arranged and paid for the pest inspection, the initial HVAC service contract, and the deep clean crew that came through before my parents moved in. I paid for the new refrigerator because the one in the house was 12 years old, and I did not want my mother managing a failing compressor in her first summer in Arizona. And I paid for the cruise. That last one needs a moment. In January of the year this story is really about, my mother mentioned, in the kind of careful offhand way she used when she wanted something and was afraid to want it directly, that a lot of people in their community were doing these 10-day cruises out of Miami, the Caribbean loop. She said, with the nice dinner packages. She had seen a brochure. She thought it might be a nice thing to do for their 41st anniversary. My father said nothing. He was reading something on his tablet. I said, "Send me the brochure." She emailed it to me that night. I looked at it for about 45 minutes, priced out the cabin categories, read the reviews, and then booked 2 tickets in a balcony cabin on the upper deck, the kind with the private outdoor space. The kind my mother had pointed to in the brochure with a small asterisk in pen. The total came to $14,260, which I paid in full, and I sent my mother the confirmation number the next morning with a note that said, "Happy early anniversary. You don't need to tell him it was me if it's easier." She told him. He texted me a thumbs-up emoji. That was the whole acknowledgement. 1 emoji. I saved the text because I thought it was important to have a record of exactly how that felt. The cruise departed from Miami on a Saturday in late April. I had not been invited to join them. The booking was for 2, always had been, because my mother had framed it as an anniversary trip and I had not pushed. Diego was not going either. Camille and Marco were not going. It was just my parents, 10 days, the Caribbean. I knew the departure date. I knew the itinerary because I had booked it. I knew they were leaving on a Saturday morning and returning the following Monday evening, which gave me 11 days, and I knew this because I checked the confirmation email I had printed and kept in the file folder where I kept all of the financial records related to the Scottsdale house. I was at my desk in Atlanta on the Thursday before their departure when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. I picked it up. The message said, "Marisol, we are so excited. Your father is already packed, can you believe it? We fly out Saturday. I'll send pictures." I texted back, "Have the best time. You deserve it." She sent a heart emoji. I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to the acquisition file I had been reviewing. On Friday evening, my phone buzzed again. I thought it was my mother with a packing question. It was not. It was a text from my father, which was unusual enough that I sat up straighter before I even read it. "Your mother and I have been talking," it said. "The cruise is family time. Just us. Didn't want you getting any ideas about joining." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down on the desk, and I squared the papers in front of me before I answered, smoothing the edges against the desk surface without looking at them, because I needed a moment that was not about the text. I had not had any ideas about joining. I had not mentioned joining. The cruise had been booked for 2 people for 3 months, and in 3 months it had never occurred to me to ask to be included. I had paid for it and sent them off and expected nothing more than a photograph of my mother on a balcony with a drink in her hand. And yet here was my father, the night before departure, sending a preemptive text to make sure I knew I was not welcome on a trip I had paid for in full. I typed back, "Enjoy yourselves. Safe travels." I put my phone in my desk drawer and closed it. I sat very still for a moment. Outside the office window, the Atlanta skyline was doing its evening thing, the lights coming on in the buildings across the street, the sky going from blue to a flat gray-purple. I had worked late enough to see this transition so many times that it had become something close to a ritual, but I did not find it comforting that evening. I opened my desk drawer and took my phone back out. I opened the text thread with my father and read it again. Then I opened a different app, the one connected to the property management file I had set up through my firm's legal counsel when I structured the purchase of the Scottsdale house. I had never shown my parents the full structure of the arrangement. They had moved in, they lived there. My father introduced it to neighbors as our place out here with the confidence of a man who assumed ownership was self-evident. But the deed had always been held in a trust-adjacent structure that I controlled entirely, with a transfer mechanism that required my signature to complete. I had intended to transfer it fully once I was certain the arrangement was stable. I had never completed the transfer. Because it had never felt like the right moment, and now, sitting at my desk at 8:15 on a Friday evening reading a text from my father telling me I was not family, I was looking at the file with a different kind of attention than I had brought to it before. I did not make any decisions that evening. I am telling this part of the story carefully because I want to be accurate about the sequence. I did not open the file and immediately do anything. I sat with it. I read the structure again the way I would read any file, systematically without emotion from the top. I looked at the transfer mechanism and the timeline provisions and the clauses I had built in during the initial structuring, which my counsel had called conservative at the time and which I had called thorough. I closed the app. I gathered my things and drove home and made dinner and did not call anyone. But on Saturday morning at 9:47, I received an automated departure notification from the cruise line. A courtesy alert I was still copied on because I had booked the reservation and never removed myself from the confirmation chain. Your reservation is now underway. Bon voyage. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop. I pulled up the property file. I looked at the structure of the holding arrangement one more time. The timeline, the transfer mechanism, the provisions that governed what I could and could not do with the asset while my parents were in residence. I sent an email to my firm's legal counsel with the subject line, Question re Scottsdale property, timing and process. Then I closed my laptop, poured a cup of coffee, and went to stand by my kitchen window, where the morning light was coming in flat and pale through the curtains, and I waited for him to write back. My parents' flight landed on a Monday evening. I knew the arrival time because it was on the confirmation email I was still copied on. I did not go to the airport. I did not need to. I had spent the 11 days they were at sea doing 3 things. I worked my regular hours. I slept adequately. And I completed, with my firm's legal counsel, the full paperwork process for listing the Scottsdale property. My counsel had been careful with me, the way good attorneys are careful when a client is doing something legal but significant. He asked me twice whether I was certain. I told him both times that I was, and I meant it both times, and he filed the necessary instruments and we listed the property at $1,040,000. a number that reflected the market movement in that neighborhood over the 14 months since I had purchased it. We had 2 serious inquiries within the first week and a written offer by day 9, which my counsel and I reviewed together on the phone while I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. The offer was strong. I accepted it. My parents were somewhere in the Caribbean when the offer was accepted. I imagined my mother on the balcony I had paid for, watching the water. I did not feel good about that image, but I did not feel uncertain either. Those are 2 different things. The closing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. I had time. I booked a flight to Scottsdale for the Wednesday after their return. I told my mother I was coming to drop off some paperwork related to the house, which was true, and that I would take them to dinner, which was also true, and which my mother received with the particular warmth she reserved for the moments when the family was going to be in the same room without it being anyone's birthday or anniversary, just because. She said, "Your father will be glad." I did not comment on that. I landed in Scottsdale on a Wednesday afternoon and drove a rental car to the house. My mother met me at the door. She was tan from the cruise and she smelled like sunscreen, and she hugged me tighter than usual and said the trip had been wonderful, truly wonderful. Did I want to see the photos? I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table and she showed me pictures on her phone. The ports, the dinner packages, the balcony at sunset. My father's voice came from the den where he was watching something on television. I said, "Is Dad going to come say hello?" My mother called his name. A moment passed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in a polo shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always wore them when he was not actually reading, which was most of the time. "Marisol," he said. The same identification. The same inflection as the anniversary dinner. "Hey, Dad," I said. "Can we sit for a minute? I have some things to go over with you about the house." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. My mother stayed at the table. I had my laptop and a manila folder, and I set the folder on the table in front of me and opened my laptop beside it. "What kind of things?" my father said. I reached into the folder and took out the first document, the property summary my counsel had prepared, a clean 2-page overview of the holding structure. I placed it on the table in front of him. "The house was never fully transferred into your name," I said. "I structured the purchase through a holding arrangement that I control. I've been meaning to explain that to you since you moved in, but there was never a right moment." My father looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. "What does that mean?" "It means the deed is in a trust structure that requires my signature to transfer. Without my signature, you don't own it." My mother said, "Marisol." "I'm not done," I said, not unkindly. I took out the second document, the accepted purchase offer, and set it on top of the first. My father looked at it. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him reading the numbers at the top of the page, the purchase price, the buyer's name, the acceptance date. His jaw moved slightly. "You sold it," he said. "I accepted an offer," I said. "The closing is in 3 weeks. While we were on the cruise." He said it flatly. "Yes." He stood up. Not fast, slowly, the way a man stands up when he is deciding what kind of scene this is going to be. "You sold our house," he said, louder now. "You went behind our backs while we were gone and you sold our house." I put my hand flat on the folder. "The house was never legally yours, Dad. That's what I'm telling you. I purchased it, I held it, and I have sold it. The proceeds, minus the outstanding costs I've been carrying, will be transferred to an account in your name at closing. That's outlined on page 2. "I don't care about page 2. His voice had gone to a different register, the one I remembered from childhood, the one that was supposed to stop conversations. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said. "Legally. Completely." My mother had her hand over her mouth. My father took a breath and I waited, and in the silence I straightened the papers in front of me without looking at him. "Why would you do this?" he said. His voice was different now. Not the register that stopped conversations, but something underneath it that I had heard less often. Something that did not know which way to go. I looked at him. "You sent me a text," I said, "the night before you left, to make sure I knew I wasn't welcome on a trip I had paid for in full. And it wasn't the first time. So I want to tell you something before I answer that question because I want to make sure you hear it in the right order. He sat back down. I do not know whether he chose to or whether his legs made the decision for him. Either way, he sat down and I took a breath and I started from the beginning. I told him about the dinner for Diego's promotion. I said, "You told your brother I worked in real estate the night I sat at your anniversary table. You said it the way you'd read a label off a can. I had just closed a 6-figure acquisition. I had been doing it for 3 years. While you were summarizing my career in 4 words to someone who wasn't listening, I was the one who had already paid for the roof over the house you were sitting in. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I told him about the roof and the furnace. I said, you told Mom you would have handled it. You hadn't handled it for 6 winters. I handled it in December of the year I turned 28, and I never mentioned it because I knew what you would do with it. I told him about the moving costs. I said, $11,400. I paid it before you could refuse it, because if I had asked first you would have said you didn't need anything from me, and you would have meant it as a comment on my ability, not your independence. I know the difference. I told him about the property taxes. Both years. The HVAC contract and the refrigerator and the pest inspection and the cleaning crew. I said each one in order, the way you read a ledger, item, amount, date, beneficiary, because that is what it was. I told him about the cruise. I said, you sent me a thumbs up. 1 emoji. For $14,260 and 10 days on a balcony I chose for Mom because she pointed to it in the brochure. Then you sent me a text the night before you left to make sure I knew not to come. You wanted to make sure I didn't get any ideas. I paused. My father's hands were flat on the table. My mother was very still. I said, every single time I was the one who wasn't family enough to acknowledge. And every single time I was the one paying for the family. I closed the folder. I slid it across the table so it was in front of him. I said, the proceeds from the sale will cover everything I've carried since you moved in, and what's left, and there is money left, a meaningful amount, goes into an account in your name. My counsel will send the transfer details before closing. You'll be fine financially. Better than fine. I stood up. My father said, Marisol, sit down. I picked up my laptop. I said, I booked us a table at 7. If you want to come, I'd like that. But I'm going to go check into my hotel first. I walked to the front door. My mother followed me. In the small entryway, with my father still at the kitchen table and the house quiet around us, she put both hands on my face the way she used to when I was small, when I had hurt myself and she was checking to see how badly. Her eyes were wet. He doesn't know how to say it, she said. I know, I said. That's not an excuse, she said, which surprised me. It was the first time I had ever heard her say it that way. I put my hand over hers. Come to dinner, I said. Both of you. 7 o'clock. She nodded. I kissed her cheek and walked out to the rental car. Behind me, I heard the door close. Not slam, just close, the latch catching with a quiet, definite click. My parents came to dinner. My father sat across from me in a restaurant booth and ate his meal and said very little. At one point, while my mother was in the restroom, he looked at me across the table and said, I didn't know you were keeping track. I wasn't keeping track, I said. I was just doing it. He looked at his water glass. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something he did not yet have words for. It was not an apology. I want to be honest about that. But it was the most present I had ever seen him be in a room with me, and that was something, even if it was not enough. Diego called me 3 days later, after my mother had clearly told him everything. He was not warm. He said I had embarrassed the family and that what I had done was cold. I let him finish. Then I asked him how much he had contributed to the Scottsdale house, to the moving costs, to any of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that wasn't the point. I said I thought it actually was the point, and I wished him a good evening and ended the call. Camille texted me the following week. Her message said, I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't know. I texted back, you don't need to apologize. I love you. She sent a heart. It was a small thing, but it landed differently than my father's emoji had. The Scottsdale house closed on a Thursday morning. My counsel sent me the confirmation and the wire details, and I forwarded the transfer information to my father's email with a short note that said the funds would clear within 2 business days. He replied with one line, "Thank you." 2 words. No period. I sat with that email for a while before I archived it. People ask me sometimes, not about this specifically because most people don't know the details, but in general they ask how you know when you've given enough. When the thing you're doing for someone becomes the thing you're doing instead of something, instead of being seen, instead of being included, instead of the conversation you actually needed to have. I don't think there's a clean answer to that. I think most people who are in it don't know they're in it until something small and specific, a text, an emoji, a seating card with the wrong name on it, finally sits on top of all the other small and specific things and makes the weight visible. I did not sell that house to punish my father. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I sold it because I finally understood that continuing to give without the transaction being named, without anyone acknowledging what the exchange actually was not generosity. It was a way of making myself invisible, which was the thing I had been trying to escape since I was 19 years old, and packed a bag and drove 4 hours away to a university where nobody already had a fixed idea of what I was. What I have now is not the same as what I wanted. I wanted a family that saw me clearly. I still want that, and I do not know yet how much of it I am going to get. My father and I talk on the phone occasionally. The calls are short. He asks about work in a way that is marginally more specific than it used to be. Last month he asked about the Nashville acquisition by name, which he had never done before. I do not know what that means or where it goes. I am trying to leave room for it without building my expectations on top of that room. My mother calls every Sunday. That part has not changed. What I know is this: the people who take you for granted do not always do it from cruelty. Sometimes they do it because the arrangement has been so stable for so long that they have stopped noticing it is an arrangement. They have stopped noticing that someone built it and tends it and pays for it. And sometimes the only way to make the arrangement visible is to change it, not to destroy it, but to put it on the table, the way I put those documents on the table, and let everyone finally see what they have been looking at all along. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you have ever been the one who handled things quietly while someone else got the toast at the dinner table, share this with someone who needs to hear it. It might be the thing that finally puts a name to something they've been carrying for a long time. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, and events are entirely fictional and do not represent real people or situations.